Boom! What's up, everyone? And welcome to the very first episode of the Diet Buddies podcast here on YouTube. This is our first episode, or our first couple episodes, putting the podcast in video form. Typically, Dr. Grady and I just record it on Zoom and take the audio, and that's how we put it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart Radio, those types of things. But here on YouTube, you get to look at Dr. Downhill's beautiful face during our conversation, and in reality, that's why we're all here. But it might be a little bit easier to share this information. You can like, share, and subscribe to the channel and our videos this way, and you can really work together to spread the message of how people can live the life they deserve, regardless if they have diabetes or not, and not feel chained down by their health and their metabolic health, things like that. So that being said, this conversation is for educational purposes only, and you should always talk to your healthcare team, healthcare professional before applying any of this information, and this conversation is not meant to diagnose or treat any disease. Without further ado, let's get into the episode, let's get into the fun stuff, and we hope you enjoy this episode of the Diet Buddies podcast. And welcome back, everyone, and fellow Diet Buddies, to another episode. We're really excited to record today and just kind of almost have a looser conversation on some of the topics like insulin resistance and fats and things like that today. So, but we normally do our segment Burst My Beta Cells at the end, but I miss Grady so much not living with him. I had a lot to, before we start recording, I had a lot to burst my beta cells, talk with him. So we're going to start right away with Burst My Beta Cells. So Grady, what's something recently that, whether it be about diabetes, your pump, everything, working out, what's something that burst your beta cells recently?
Yeah, so I feel like I've talked about this multiple times, but dealing with insurances and pharmacies and all that jazz is just super frustrating, especially right now because, like I said, this year I changed to a different insurance plan, and as a result, I have to change the mail order that I use for my pharmacy, and so right now, I'm just going to say it. Right now, I'm using Walgreens Alliance RX Pharmacy, and it has been the worst experience I've ever had. They just don't communicate very well with me or the doctor, and it's just been a complete disaster. So, like I've talked about how the insulin, the generic insulin that they had sent, was going bad very quickly. The half-life was going bad very quickly. And so I worked with my doctor on getting a prescription for the name brand Novolog. Okay. And so he sent that in, and he specifically said name brand only. And when I looked at my account online, it had the generic version of it. And so then I'm like, okay. So I first called my doctor's nurse again, and I said, okay, I just want to make sure that you guys sent in specifically Novolog and not, the generic version. She's like, yep, he specifically wrote down Novolog or name brand only. And so I was like, okay. So then and then she's like, and they're supposed to tell us if they're going to change anything about the prescription before they do it. And so I think I'm pretty sure they had already sent the insulin anyways. And, but I guess kind of fortunately they sent it to the wrong address. They sent it to the one in Nebraska, which that one in Nebraska has never been associated with my account. So I don't even know how they got that.
Oh man.
So that was a whole ordeal too. So then they had to return that because that's an overnight thing that they usually ship insulin overnight. And so they had to reroute that. So that actually went back to their warehouse or whatever. But then when they sent the new one, they actually sent the Novolog. So they did something right there after screwing that up. So we got that worked out. And then I had to get new test strips, which somehow works seamlessly. But
wow. So how long, if you had to guess, how many total extra time between calling pharmacy, Walgreens, doctor, insurance company, and then actually waiting. Well, no, don't include that. But just the extra time of coordinating all that stuff, which isn't the time that it takes to give yourself bolus, do all the actual diabetes things, just the logistics of it. How much extra time do you think you spent recently on this endeavor?
I would say at least 6 to 8 hours.
6 to 8 hours.
Being on hold and, talking with people. Because, I mean, initially, it was just a complete mess. I was on the phone with my insurance company, with a representative there. And so he actually took me through, which I was very appreciative of. The insurance guy, he actually stayed on the phone with me and helped me coordinate with the pharmacy. And even he's like, they're just kind of throwing us around the ringer. Like, they're not giving us any solid thing. So, which I was appreciative of him, but at the same time, it took way longer than it needed to.
Sure. Yeah, that's crazy. I've definitely had similar experiences getting thrown around the ringer with insurance companies, and I think a lot of diabetics do, mostly type 1, but I'm sure type 2 as well. And so, like, I remember I had test strips and insulin denied for me because somewhere in the insurance, like, logistics trade, they thought I was type 2. And like, why are you testing so much? Why are you using so much insulin? I was like, why? What do you mean, why? Who are you to say why?
Yeah.
And then, anyways, but you spending 6 to 8 hours, and over the course of 2 weeks, how long has this been? You think 3 weeks?
Well, probably a couple months, actually.
Okay, but still, 8 hours. We'll just round it up. 8 hours over just 1 to 2 months. I mean, how many more things could you have done? How much more then extra stress has that put on you? And I think that's something that non-diabetics really don't think about, that a diabetic goes through. It's not even
because then
sugar management.
It's not only that, it's like also with all this confusion, I am so scared that they are going to put something through and then it's not going to be covered by my insurance, and therefore I'm going to be charged full price for it, and I'm not going to be able to pay for it because it's just, that all that stuff is just super expensive. And so, like, I kept checking to make sure before they sent it had covered it so that the price was lower. Because, at some points I would check it and it would be like for the test strips, for example, before the insurance went through, it was like, I think like $900 for 700 strips. And I'm like,
what?
There's no way I can afford that right now. And but eventually the insurance came through and got it back down. But yeah, I was just like, that was probably one of the biggest stressors for me. It was like, I hope with all this confusion going on, I don't just like go bankrupt because of it.
Sure. No, that's a scary feeling. Especially then, even a scary feeling of you getting, let's say, just the insulin that wasn't really working with your body. You do all this, they send you the wrong thing, but because of timing, you have to use it, and then, and it literally is affecting your health. But that's also just, you and I really haven't talked to, or just had an episode just yet about insurances and just pharmacy. But that $900 for 700 strips, that was probably the list price. That's probably like the actual objective price, where if you didn't have insurance, that's what you would have paid.
Yep.
But what pharmacy companies do, and what companies do, is they make this price, and whatever insurance they're in, they have a negotiated, agreed, contracted rate that drops it down, and then based on your policy, depends on if you're going towards your deductible, copay, whatever. That makes it what you, as the end consumer, are. But that is all started upon whatever the number they decided to say was the list price. And that list price essentially is just almost like a thought of, you go to the grocery store and you see like a 25% off discount, and you're like, oh great, but somehow the grocery store got away with raising the price by 25%, so it's like the same price anyways.
Yep.
Not exactly the same thing that companies do, both medical and pharmacy companies do, but you get the idea that they just jack up the initial price so that when the contracted rate comes in with insurance, it's a lower rate, and then you pay a different rate, but it's all based on the initial thing, and there's no regulation in that. And how frustrating that is to somebody where they can't have any say in it.
Yeah, and look at that price difference. So I guess I didn't say what I actually paid for it. I think it was
You did
like,
not.
I think it ended up being like $125, something like that. And so look at that price difference. Almost 900 or sorry, almost $800 different. Do you really think that they're losing that much money off of that? No, they are not. They're still making money off of that $125 that I paid.
Yeah. No, it's insane. And I think maybe in the future, sometime in the future, before the year's up, we'll have to like put our brains together and think about it like a objective, logistical way to talk about what we deal with insurance companies. Maybe even get a little more technical, and do some more research about it all too. But because it's just so frustrating for diabetics that don't know and that just literally are helpless. For diabetics that do know but don't know how to fight it. For everyone else, like, yeah, I'm about to go on more rants about it. So,
All right, let's get to you. So what was your
okay.
burst your beta cells?
So I was burst my beta cells almost because I was scared, and so it wasn't like this frustrating thing. But I'll just quickly tell a story that I briefly told you. So this past weekend, I got some really good news in terms of my licensing for being a chiropractor in the state of Wisconsin and things like that. I was very excited, so naturally go and celebrate, right? And I'm like to think of myself as a little more down to earth than maybe you, Grady. But so I celebrated then with getting margaritas, and so I was drinking a little bit on Saturday night as a type 1. And type 1, there's a risk of being low and there's a lot of risk of being high, but a lot of type 1s can actually unfortunately pass away from drinking from low blood sugar. And now in a non-diabetic, that's because, or in a non-diabetic, alcohol can rate or lower blood sugars. Ethanol can lower your blood sugar if you are a non-diabetic. So there's still that biochemistry that's still like really not understood in a type 1, but that's still a thing. And most type 1s that do pass away from alcohol ends up because of lack of cortical function or lack of like using your brain and over giving yourself insulin and passing away. And so I was out having margaritas, enjoying myself, being safe, or trying to be as safe as possible. And I woke up, at 12:30 with low blood sugar. My blood sugar was 29. And when you wake up with low blood sugar, you're, oh my God, what's going on? You got the adrenaline rush, you got cortisol on you, and you're dropping real low. And I had at least 100 plus grams of carbs between 7 glucose tabs and a crap ton of blueberries and strawberries, and probably even closer to 150. And as I'm eating it and it's kind of like coming back alive, but so low, I'm like, oh man, I'm over bolusing or overcorrecting for sure. Like I'm definitely overeating, but at this moment I don't care because it's late at night and I want to go back to bed. And then I wake up, and if you overeat, you think you're going to be super high. My blood sugar was 80 6 hours later. So even though that sounds like, oh, that was great, what that really means is I was dropping so low, so fast, and despite having 100, 150 grams of carbs, man, my blood sugar was fighting. It was fighting trying to get up there. And if I didn't eat what I did, and I was a little less careful, then who knows what could have unfortunately happened. So a lesson to take away to maybe still kind of take things back a bit, even in celebration times.
Yes, that is exactly the reason why I have never drank before. Because it's just, it's just, to me, it's not worth the risk. And because it's scary. Like, that situation is scary. Like, a moment later, and you may not have had the wherewithal to get downstairs and eat something or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, scary stuff.
And I say that openly and from a vulnerable standpoint, even on this podcast, just because we're all human and we make mistakes. But yeah, it's super scary, and I probably would have been better if I had a margarita or no margaritas. And even that now, Chenny Cat. Anyways, I had a song stuck in my head, and yeah, it could have been better, but we live, we learn, we do better. So that was kind of like my like fearful burst my beta cells almost.
Yeah.
But the whole point of that is that there's a lot that goes into what we do. There's a whole lot. And understanding things like insulin resistance is just as complex as living with all of this stuff. Last episode we started talking about insulin resistance and fat a little more, insulin resistant mechanisms. But this podcast, Grady and I have read through a review article that I thought was very thorough. That was published near the end of 2017 in the American Journal of Physiology, Endocrinology, Metabolism. Wow, it's a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
And titled Modeling Insulin Resistance in Rodents by Altering in Diet, What Have High Fat and High Calorie Diets Revealed? And even though the title says rodents, there's plenty of discussion on humans as well. So we kind of just wanted to walk through these some of these points in this article and just talk about them and what we think about some of these points and then what we think about clinically and how we live our daily lives. So first of all, it kind of starts off by talking about just using different types of models, either whether it be different types of rats or humans in insulin resistance studies. Always something to keep in mind, right? So Grady, what are your thoughts about using rats and different types of rats with these types of studies?
Yeah, so I thought this section of this article was a bit eye-opening, and I think it's helpful for people to read, just to, like I said, open your eyes, but also get a little bit more information on mice and how, depending on the type of mice that the said study that you're looking at is using, it can somewhat skew those results. Because if you're using something that's blocking out a gene, it's going to be different than a mouse that's actually put, I would say, epigenetically in a situation. So, for example, if they block out a gene that creates insulin resistance versus taking a mouse and doing stuff to it, whether that's feeding it something or not allowing it to exercise, and putting that mouse then in a situation where it develops insulin resistance, and then testing stuff on that, it's going to be different because the mechanisms are different and the pathways in the body have now changed because genes are turned off and other genes are turned on. So I think in regards to that, it's very helpful. And I think it's something to pay attention to if you're going to be doing and looking into a lot of research or hanging your hat on a lot of research, because if it's on, models of mice that aren't necessarily congruent with, real life situations, then that data just might not be as accurate for, human people. And so, so I think it's something to keep in mind and something to be aware of. So that way you can navigate the confusion that science can bring, because there's a lot of conflicting data out there with any situation and any topic. So to be able to navigate that a little bit more cleaner is going to help you understand what's actually going on.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that was the whole point of why they put this part of the article first. It was that, there's a lot of good research to learn, or a lot of good information to understand by genetically modifying rats and seeing how it affects their metabolism. In fact, that's how we actually learn about a lot of things. What happens when this thing isn't there? And that's how we really started understanding leptin deficiency and what ghrelin does, and a lot of these other hormones that play with your hypothalamus to your gut and all these other signalings that can create obesity. Like sometimes people are literally just obese, not because they're big bones or they don't have self-control, but there is actually a deficiency where they don't make a hormone where it tells them there's no signal to say stop eating, for example. But like you said, if you're using those models, and then trying to understand what's going on with insulin resistance in those models, let's just use that. So in a rat that doesn't have leptin, for example, or something, but then you're trying to apply that information to humans that do have leptin, that doesn't really make too much sense, because trying to compare apples to oranges, not just because it's rats and mice and humans, but because it's literally the metabolism is just different. And they end up concluding the best way to study it is by, or summarizing this section by saying the best way to study metabolic dysfunctions is by doing a DIO, or dietary induced obesity. So literally what we do. And we as humans, we feed until we are obese. And that's what these rats do. We do sometimes a lot of cruel things to rats. And I've definitely read some methods about some different things that rats go under, and bless their little hearts. Rats actually have big hearts. Mice have small hearts. But sidetrack. And so literally feeding a mouse, you really want to be conscientious of what the methods are. That being said, but you shouldn't only use methods to neglect what a study concludes too. I was listening to a TED Talk recently and about conspiracy theories. And if you disagree with somebody's point, the easiest way to then solidify your point that you believe, your biasy, is by finding a reason to poke holes at their logic. And in scientific literature, that's the method section. That's saying, well, that doesn't really count. You can't really think about it because this is all wrong. And it's this balance, this yin and yang of understanding what's in the method section and what's that limitation, not discrediting it, but understanding where it's coming from and trying to apply it in a objective way, opposed to just poking holes and saying, oh, doesn't matter. They only use a genetically modified rat. I don't care. And so I thought that was an interesting point I've heard recently. And but that's why you can't just skip the methods if you're trying to actually read science. So anyways, the article then continues. Once it tries to convince you DIO is the best way to study mice and rats in terms of obesity and metabolic dysfunction, and then starts to talk about insulin action and insulin resistance and different tissues and how they're different. And so the three tissues that it focuses on are arguably the tissues that have the most impact on overall insulin resistance. So your whole body can be insulin resistant, but then different tissue types. And when I say tissue types, that could mean muscles, that could mean your brain, it could mean your skin, it could mean your adipose, it could mean your liver, kidneys, etc. Literally any organ, any tissue has the potential to have a different mechanism. And so the three it focuses on are muscle, liver, and adipose. So before I have a couple thoughts on diving into muscle. And so I'll ask you some questions in a second, Doc, but I think the one reason to always focus on muscle is not just because it's readily available, but because as humans, it literally makes up 20 to 40% of our mass. It literally makes up, if you didn't understand muscle physiology, you wouldn't have a great picture of overall body metabolism. And when we then, maybe us as chiropractors, as we are working with your body and maybe not this specific, functional medicine way, but just with your body, muscles and your skeleton are so important on your overall health for that reason. Like you shouldn't just work out just to look good in a bikini or in a swimsuit or for the summertime, but because your muscles are literally impact everything to do with your health. And when you work out, you shouldn't be just thinking about your heart. You should be thinking about your whole entire body because it literally impacts everything.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You're going to impact all different types of physiology when you're exercising and moving. So whether that's glucose metabolism, whether that's blood flow, whether that's brain function, because exercise is stimulating the brain, and so you need that to keep a healthy brain. All that stuff is very important. And so if you're neglecting your understanding of muscles, or you're just neglecting muscles in general because you're not using them or you're not trying to stimulate that, then it's going to have a big impact on your health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to mealtime, your muscles consume about anywhere from 40 to 80% of the overall glucose load that's inputted to your body at that time. Uh, so your resting glucose and metabolism rate before and after exercise completely changes what happens at that meal.
Oh yeah.
So if you go on social media and you look at diabetics who are athletes, or you look at any kind of athlete and try to look at their metabolism, like it's drastically different because they have trained their body and affected their whole body from just doing exercise, which
Hmm.
you can take really simple steps to start moving and actually start affecting those things.
And those changes in metabolism, those things can be somewhat long term. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say the most important thing about that is the consistency of it. If you're consistent with getting those muscles activated, that change in physiology is going to be much more deep rooted. It's going to be much more effective. You're going to notice much more change with that, and on more of a consistent basis. If you're kind of off and on, kind of here and there, maybe like once or twice a week, or even like 3 times a week. Some people need more than that. If you stay consistent with it, then that change in metabolism is much more, I don't want to say permanent, but much more long lasting than it is if you're just kind of hit and miss and really random with your workouts. So, like, you could work out 3 days a week, but if you're working out 3 days in a row and then the rest of the week you're off, your body's just kind of all over the place. You're kind of yo-yoing back and forth with metabolism, with weight loss, with blood flow, all that stuff. So being consistent with it is, I think, the most important thing.
Hmm. So what are ways that you personally then do that with like what is your current like workout regimen right now for the purpose of metabolism?
Yeah, so that's a great point because this is something I've been focusing on in the last, probably the last 2 or 3 months. Now that we're back in the gym, yeah. So I've been doing. I started a new workout program. Actually, it's an old workout program that I used to do several years
Mhm.
ago, and so essentially
Back
what
when
it
you're like
is.
280.
No, a little bit after that. I
Grady used
still
to rest.
I still
Go
have
ahead.
those workouts, but I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm man enough to do that right now.
Grady used if Grady used to wrestle heavyweight and was a big football player back in the day, and you wouldn't believe it if you looked at him now in person. But anyways, go on.
But yeah, so right now what I'm doing is I'm working out, lifting weights. When I say working out, I'm lifting weights about 5 to 6 days a week, depending on how my body feels. If my body starts to feel like it's kind of worn down, then I'll take an extra day off. But I stay consistent with that. But on my days off, I will do some sort of exercise still. So whether that's cardio or something to get my body moving, something to get my heart pumping. Because if I totally quit, especially if it's 2 days, one day I'm probably okay with. But if it's 2 days, I will definitely start to notice a decrease in metabolism. Specifically, obviously, since I'm monitoring my blood sugar, I could see it right away with that. My blood sugars start to kind of creep up a little bit and stay a little bit higher. So if I stay somewhat consistent with it, then I can maintain that metabolism. I don't have to go super hard. I honestly, I probably don't have to work out or lift weights 6 days a week, but that's just what I like to do. But the point is, even if I wasn't working out 6 days a week as far as lifting weights, I would try to be exercising at least 6 days a week, if not every day of the week. And like I said, exercise can look differently for different people. So that can be lots of cardio, or lots of lifting weights or circuit training, stuff like that. I think, especially in regards to, like I said, maintaining metabolism and keeping consistent, if you can do something that gets your heart pumping, gets your muscles moving every day, doesn't have to be, you don't have to kill yourself every day. But if you can do something every day, you can kind of help maintain that. Like I said, the consistency is that most important part.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And What about, so you're running, you're lifting, are you rolling around doing jiu-jitsu right now too?
No, I have not been since COVID and everything, but
Gotcha.
hopefully that'll start back up soon.
Gotcha. Okay. Are there days that you do like tour days, like you run and you lift, or you do like stretching and lifting, or something like that?
Yeah, so I'll run. Well, since I lost my headphones, I haven't been running as much because I like running with my headphones in. I need something to distract myself. But
Hmm. It's called
um,
mental strength there,
yeah, I
Grady.
know,
Get some.
I
Get
know.
some. Just kidding.
But usually I'll run 2 to 3 times a week, and like I said, I'll try to always hit, or at least try to hit that on my off days. But I will do that also on my lifting days, especially if it's nice and sunny and hot out. I like running when it's sunny out. So
Weird. Um, okay. Nice. Cool. Yeah, I agree. Consistency and just moving your body, just for the pure fact, again, your muscles are literally, you know, such a large part of your body mass, and you're not just doing it for you, you're not just doing it to look good, not just even doing it for your heart. You're doing it for your diabetes. You're doing it for your family. You're doing it so you can pick up your family. You can hug your family. You can see
mhm.
your family. Every movement that you do, the more consistent you are with your movement, the better your life will be. Just period.
Yep,
There's no doubt about it.
yep. Now and in the long term, because I have a
Mm-hmm.
patient right now that I'm really working on. He's a type 2, and he doesn't like following his diet very much. He really doesn't like doing any exercise, and I had to have a heart to heart with him. And I was like, you got to think about not only the short term, but also what's your life going to look like later on. And I told him my story about my grandpa and how he started losing fingers and toes, and eventually had both of his legs amputated. And I don't know anybody who would want to have a quality life like that. Um, so make those decisions now, make those habits now, so that way you set yourself up for a higher quality of life now and later on.
Yeah, agreed. And I think if you just start doing one, whether if you start changing your diet, like, and you start to see like results, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's easier than to get to the gym. You're like, if I'm putting in this work, why am I not like doing this other part?
Yeah.
And that thought might be even easier if you don't change your diet at all and you just start moving your body more.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh my gosh, like this feels good, but like I'm trying to sleep more, and like how can I sleep more so I can do better at the gym? But if I'm doing that, like how can I eat better so I can perform better at the gym?
Yep.
Start with one or the other, and then it starts to become a lot easier.
Yeah. I talk a lot about momentum with people. It's all
Mm,
about momentum. And like, so you wake up in the morning, do something very simple that you wouldn't want to do. So like some people have a hard time just getting up in the morning on their first alarm. So I say, all right, get up and go. All you have to do is get up out of bed, and I want you to go brush your teeth. And once you brush your teeth or you do something super simple like that, you start to gain momentum. Now you're like, okay, now I'm going to stretch, or now I'm going to meditate, or now I'm going to do some push ups, or whatever it is. You start to gain that momentum. And when you start building off of that, you start feeling better. You start making better decisions. That starts to become more of a habit. So building momentum is something that I try to harp on, and something that I always implement in my life, because there's days where you get up, you just don't want to do anything, but it's just like, all right, I'm gonna pick something super easy that I have no reason why I can't do this, so I'm gonna go do this. And then after you do that, you feel more accomplished, even if it's just slightly. That change in your brain is like, okay, I can do this today. I can do more. All right, what's next? Let's go. Let's do this. So that's kind of my philosophy, especially on days where I just don't want to do anything, and it gets me going, and my day is much better as a result.
if you were to write a book, Grady, it would be called Momentum. You got very jacked. For your level of jackness wasn't
all the way, but I feel like very few people get to see you jacking us all the way, and I think
Yeah.
you're pretty jacked at that little spiel. Oh, that was awesome. I agree. It's just the little things. And speaking of little things, let's talk about more myocytes.
There you go.
Oh, greatest transition ever. Myocytes, a muscle cell. And so, going back then to the cellular level of what insulin resistant is in a muscle, you know, we just kind of talked about why you should care about it in the first place. But there's essentially, you know, you can almost think about it as like 4 different theories on what could cause insulin resistance. There's probably even more than that, but there's like 4 big theories. And you always need to keep it in context of what somebody's talking about. And sometimes, at least I find, when I try to actually read and understand scientific literature, they're not as specific in the paper as you'd like it to be. And I've definitely been like, in what context are you talking about this? Like, I really like, to the author, it might seem straightforward, but I have no idea what you're referring to. So anyways, before I expand on that, I want to almost say like these 4 major theories that this review paper talks about is you could have insulin resistance in the muscle from having too many lipids within the muscle cell. That's one very common theory. Another theory is not specific, not just general lipids, but specifically increased levels of DAGs or diacylglycerols, which is a triglycerol or triglyceride, like on your blood lab you might have seen with your doctor. That's that's 3. A DAG is 2. So increase in DAGs or other bioactive small fats like acetyl CoAs and acetyl, those types of things. But that's an example of something that this paper didn't talk about specifically if that was in the cell or in the blood. And I think that's a big point. And I'll talk about that why in a second. As well as mitochondrial dysfunction in the muscle. So that's the third way, is it could be rooted from mitochondrial dysfunction within the muscle cell itself and what causes mitochondrial dysfunction to begin with. And then lastly, which is almost more of like a bigger picture, is just deficit of extracellular glucose delivery, meaning your body isn't very good at giving and distributing glucose anywhere else but your muscles because of blood flow, because like literally efficiency of your heart or microvascular damage within your capillaries, because diabetics can both have microvascular and macrovascular damage. But in reality, of those 4 subjects, it's probably a combination of all 4. If I've learned anything about through my education, is that it's literally, chances are, everything impacts everything.
Yep, everything causes everything.
Right, which is frustrating as a patient. It's frustrating as a doctor. It's frustrating as a philosopher. I've had lots of debates on what 0 means recently, but that's besides the point of this podcast. So those are kind of like the 4 big takeaways and 4 like headlines of what causes insulin resistance in muscles. Now, Grady, when you hear and when you read through this increase of intracellular lipids within the muscle cell, what did you think about what the authors were summarizing in this review article versus what you feel and think and see in your office with patients? It's not like we do cellular biochemistry with our patients, but just the physiology of what these guys are saying.
Yeah, so they don't really go specifically into what is putting the fat in the muscle cell. And so just to kind of expand on that, at least my opinion on how that gets there, is when you have a higher amount of free fatty acids in the bloodstream, and when you have insulin resistance, you're going to have more free fatty acids in there because your body is producing those to help get those for energy for the cells, because it's having a hard time getting that sugar into the cells, and therefore that cell is going to use fatty acids for energy. And so if you're having more fatty acids in there, at least, and this can be a cycle or cyclical thing where the more fatty acids you have in there, the more insulin resistant you are, and the more insulin resistant you are, the more free fatty acids that you're going to have in the cell. So there can be a reciprocal relationship there. But at the same time, like I said, you're going to have, with insulin resistance, more free fatty acids flowing around. But at the same time, in a situation where you are more ketogenic or carnivore type diet, you're also going to have more free fatty acids floating around because you don't have glucose to use for energy. You're using those free fatty acids. So in that case, you may, I don't think there's enough definitive research to really say, but you may have some sort of insulin resistance with that cell, with specifically muscle cells, because there's a lot of talk right now of muscle sparing and or glucose sparing with the muscles. So essentially, what's going on there is this scenario of those free fatty acids getting into the cell and being utilized by that muscle cell for energy, and therefore it doesn't need the glucose. And so if you were to have a big shot of glucose hit the system, the muscle's like, hey, we're good. We got all these free fatty acids for energy. And so therefore it looks like a lot of insulin resistance because the glucose in the blood is going to spike and it's not going to go down very quickly because the muscles are like, hey, we're good. We don't need all this sugar. We're going to burn all this fatty acid. So it looks like insulin resistance, but it very quickly changes if you continue to have sugar. It changes back to, okay, we got all the sugar. We're going to use sugar now because it's much easier to burn than fat.
You said two things there that I thought were really, really important. One is I'll comment again a little later, but you said, these people, like this article doesn't really talk about how those fats get in the cell. And that's literally almost like the point I wanted to make about this is that there's this internal environment that we're trying to understand within happen cells and what happens within different types of cells. But that's not even very clear. But then there's a different discussion, debates and arguments of what gets those things there in the first place. And that's where the diet comes in, like you already kind of mentioned. And, that's where so many other factors come in. But A doesn't lead to B. And I think these people in this review article essentially also say this too. Just because high lipids in a muscle cell does not mean that you are consuming high lipids in your diet. It doesn't mean you should avoid fat because fat will get in your muscle, and high fat and muscle leads to insulin resistance, and then insulin resistance, cardiovascular complications, and you die. That's like it's not that linear by any means. So that's really important. But then you were also saying the term glucose sparing, and then the examples that you said was really, really good. But I almost wanted to then expand a little further on what glucose sparing could really mean, and through a simple analogy that I used to use when I tutored biochemistry for other students. And so glucose sparing means it's this idea that we have glucose in our blood. As diabetics, we should be very familiar with always checking that. There's this constant level of glucose that needs to be maintained. When things happen and that level drops or increases, then your body adapts to it. But let's use the example of fight or flight. Let's use the example that you're in a sympathetic situation and you're about to run from a bear. Okay. Glucose sparing, no, let's not use that. Let's say that while in the middle of the night and your blood sugar was lower in the middle of the night. Essentially what I want to get to is low blood sugar, right? So glucose sparing with lower blood sugar would look like, okay, my liver is now creating glucose. There is now glucose that is getting pumped into my blood. But instead of your muscles trying to do the same thing and pump glucose into your blood, what you're trying to do is run away, right? Those muscles need that energy. So it's going to spare the glucose that's in your blood, that's in your body, by using the glycogen and the muscle and just intrinsically and all the components, the glycogen, everything else, proteins even sometimes, to create glucose for itself and stay within the muscle. And the cell then doesn't take away glucose from the blood in the body, it spares it, and it then can use its own internal source of energy. That's what glucose sparing is. It's saying, trying to not use the glucose that's in the blood, because there's other sources and other chemistry going on that allows that cell to function without it.
I like that. That's a great way to describe it.
So, because I think it can get very confusing, glucose sparing versus, all these other terms that we start using glucose a million different times, and then start using glycogen, and we start using then, glucokinase, and I don't know, that was the first thing that came to my head, and, all these other things. And it can get confusing. So again, the context of how we're talking about these things and then talking about diets is literally so important. And you can't just start talking about this stuff out of the blue. So that being said, almost so reeling it back in. This article talks a lot about how intracellular lipids cause insulin resistance, and so it cites a whole bunch of different articles that say so. And to be objective, I'm not saying that there's not that out there. That is science that's been highly published. So lipids in muscles could necessarily be bad, but there's something called the athletic paradox, or athlete paradox, where actually an athlete has higher concentrations of fat within and lipids within the muscle. And you and I were kind of talking about this a little before we even recorded, but I don't know about you, but I would rather try to have my metabolism mirror and try to reflect something of an athlete than somebody who's sedentary. Why would I want to understand and then emulate being a couch potato? Unless this, all right, I'm just gonna leave there. I thought of trying to do some joke with Mr. Potato Head, but I'm moving forward. And so why would I want to emulate being a couch potato versus emulate somebody who's a triple jump athlete in the Olympics, and they have higher lipids in their muscle, and their muscles can be explosive, and their metabolism is on point. They can burn calories. They can be efficient with insulin. The brain is functioning, low gut dysfunction, all these other things. Why would you not want to figure out how to emulate that? And the fact that if you do think high fats in diet lead to high fats in blood, that lead to high fats in muscles, and therefore you should avoid fat and not eat fat, but then don't respect the actually athletes have higher levels of lipids in their muscle and yet have better insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance scores, then why, that just is mind-blowing to me. And it's a paradox because they seem literally polar opposites, and no one knows why the athlete paradox really exists. So
yeah, and I think the point that people should take away from this, because I'm assuming probably not everybody listening to this is a high-level athlete, but at the same time you can be your own high-level athlete. So whatever that means to you, like I said before, the consistency is key. So if you're consistently exercising and consistently working out, that's what an athlete does. They consistently train. They consistently are trying to improve and work their bodies. So if you're doing that for you, whether that just means walking or running or swimming, whatever it is, if you're doing that on a consistent basis, you're getting more to that spectrum of an athlete physiology. You may not be performing like a high-level athlete, but your physiology is going to be much closer to that.
Wow, we need that. You are on the motivational train today, Doc. That's awesome. Be your own athlete. Who cares about being a high-performing athlete or a superstar? Just because you wanted to be an NBA player, but you're 43 years old, there's no reason why you still can't play basketball and still can act in your mind as man, I'm going to be so good at basketball that my diabetes doesn't even know that I'm a star. There's, be your own athlete, be your own, hero of, of just your body. Like, just do it. And man, I love that. Be your own athlete. We got to figure out how to use the word diabetes in there somehow and put it on a shirt, and then with your face on it. I bet have you been working on your motivational interviewing skills with your patients? Because it seems like you're very motivated.
I'm just fired up tonight, I guess.
I like it. But yeah, so just be your own athlete. It's not comparing yourself to others. It's you versus you. And are you better than you were yesterday? Even if it's 1%, if that's 1% better sleep, that means you've had now 3 days in a row where you've got up and brushed your teeth and then stretched, whatever it might be. Yoga is considered being an athlete. Walking is an athlete. Don't just freaking move. Anyways, I also thought this was interesting. As they were talking about this intracellular lipid theory, was that the role of triglycerides. And this, I'm assuming they're talking about in the blood. This is one of those examples that the context isn't that clear sometimes in articles. I'm assuming they were saying that when you have higher triglycerides, typically people think higher triglycerides, that's on the lipid panel and heart disease. And we kind of talked about this last time, and you went on really good tangents last time about what a lipid panel could be used for. But these guys were essentially saying that triglycerides really are only an effective marker at dysfunctional muscle glucose metabolism. Not glucose metabolism, not whole body, but how your muscles are using glucose metabolism. And when you look at triglycerides, that's what you should be thinking of. How are my muscles using glucose? And therefore, I can see that through my triglycerides in my blood. That's what these authors are saying near the end of 2017. And I think that's a very interesting point to consider, just because everyone is always obsessed with cholesterol and triglycerides.
Yeah. I think, if I remember correctly, they also stated, because they stated that, most of your glucose is deposited into the muscle cells. At the same time, a large portion of your lipids are stored in the fat cells, the muscle cells as well, because you also use those for energy. And so, connecting those two dots as far as if you have high lipid levels in the blood, then that probably means that it's not getting into the cell of the muscles, and or the muscles already have plenty of fat to burn, and so they don't need any more of it. And so again, it's a good indicator for insulin resistance and just overall poor glucose metabolism. But at the same time, you can also take that information and say, okay, if I have poor metabolism of glucose or insulin resistance at the muscle cells, then what do I need to do to help improve the insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity at that muscle cell? We've talked about that before, and we've talked pretty much this whole podcast about exercise, because exercise stimulates the GLUT4 receptors, which then bring glucose in. And so it bypasses your need for insulin. And so the insulin resistance becomes less of a player, and therefore you can help improve that whole situation.
That's exactly actually what I was about to get into. That was perfect, because the bypassing of insulin to put GLUT4 on your cells and your muscles is huge. One of the theories, or other theories specifically with DAGs and other, acetyl-CoAs and other lipid type molecules, is that essentially downstream, I don't think they're at this point in this podcast, we need to talk about the actual cell biology of the cascade of what happens to what proteins have this and that afterwards. But essentially, the pathway ends up being that you are less likely to phosphorylate other proteins so that GLUT4 gets in your receptor. With higher DAG concentrations and acetyl-CoA, you get lower ability to put that GLUT4 or that Monsters Inc. door that we've described in previous podcasts to be open to allow glucose into the cell, therefore helping your glucose levels. But like you said, and talking about muscles and working out pretty much this whole time, if you do that, that's going to bypass something like that. And hence again, the whole athlete's paradox. If they have higher fat cells or higher fat within their cell that is pretty poor at creating GLUT4s and putting it on the cell membrane, but yet they exercise, or maybe that's part of the discussion on why there is a paradox and why you see that in the first place. Who knows? Maybe it's literally just this extreme bypassing. This is extreme, like saying F you to everything inside. I'm doing my own thing, which is very, very typical, or I guess almost like classic of an athlete, of saying, screw you, I'm doing it anyways, and figure out a way to do it. So when you're an athlete, when you're your own athlete, you're saying screw you to what's going on inside your cells, and I'm going to live a healthy life, and I'm going to get my glucose under control, get my glucose into my cell, despite having high lipids, and boom, I'm an athlete, I'm amazing, glucose is under control, end of story. Give me the first place medal. Oh man. But there's lots of other, different mechanisms of DAGs and lipids of that, not just this whole phosphorylation and GLUT4 thing, but plenty of other things when NF-kappa B and other types of how inflammation can arise and cause it craziness. But I almost want to jump down to mitochondrial dysfunction within a muscle cell. So Grady, why don't you kind of walk us through what that really means? Or when you hear just that phrase, what is dysfunction of mitochondria within a muscle cell mean to you?
So when I hear mitochondrial dysfunction, my brain automatically goes to what causes or what things can generate mitochondrial dysfunction. And those things are simple in the fact that they're generic, because inflammation and reactive oxygen species, which is somewhat a form of inflammation to a certain degree, those things will disrupt your mitochondria's ability to do its job, which is producing energy. And so that somewhat comes back to the diet, because if you're eating a high inflammatory diet, you're going to have more inflammation, you're going to have more reactive oxygen species, and that's going to impact your mitochondrial function. At the same time, if you have an athlete who's overtraining, then that can create a lot of inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction. But other sources of inflammation, like toxic exposure in your environment, whether that's your water, your air, what's being put on your skin, things like that can also create a lot of inflammation and reactive oxygen species. But then also, liver dysfunction, because if the liver is not able to detoxify things, then those reactive oxygen species start to build up in the body, and they create havoc everywhere.
And we'll talk more about the liver in just a few moments. But yeah, it's nice because it's generic, but at the same time it's not nice because it's generic.
Exactly.
And so the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, as everyone always says. I actually had a professor that used to say the mitochondria is the garden of death. She was a different kind of person, but she always said that to the point that mitochondria do much more than just be the powerhouse of the cell and make ATP. But anyways, so there are all these things that impact the function of mitochondria, and in muscle cells you actually have multiple mitochondria. You have lots of them, and you actually can generate more depending on your activity level. And you've already kind of briefly touched on overtraining, but yeah, those reactive oxygen species, cytokines, and inflammation. Some people might have just be hearing cytokines for the first time with cytokine storms that they might have read with articles with COVID. Not trying to link one to another, but just trying to give people a reference point. And cytokines are just essentially chemical messengers that are inflammatory in nature. But you can have very few cytokines that are that are anti-inflammatory, but most of them are pro-inflammatory, and that just wreak havoc on the dysfunction of your mitochondria to work. And what that really means is that a cell wouldn't be able to survive without the mitochondria. And it's almost like a really interesting benefit of being a functional medicine practitioner and thinking about the body this way, because very few times would a traditional doctor think, oh, that got it, your mitochondria is messed up, that's what's causing your pain. I don't know. But trying to understand how these things are impacted is really important, because if you can target these things and target how the membrane of the mitochondria works, or how you're making more, or what's stopping the genesis of more mitochondria, that will fill in the gaps, or can fill in the gaps to certain types of care. For example, in movies, when people died of cyanide, what cyanide would do is you would bite the capsule and would literally stop some chemicals in your mitochondria from working. Like, that's what that chemical did. It stops the transport of electrons, yada, 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 and your mitochondria stops working, and within seconds, you die.
Mm-hmm.
So if your mitochondria stop working in only a couple seconds and you die, those things are freaking important.
Mm-hmm.
And so then taking the approach of trying to limit reactive oxygen species, of trying to keep inflammation down, of trying to have the right nutrients for your mitochondria, and specifically targeting within your muscles, and like you said, overtraining, undertraining, these types of things, that's really important to move forward in those conversations as well. And something that maybe you should think about as an individual advocating for yourself, or if your provider saying, what is that? Is that hogwash, or should I actually learn about it?
Mm-hmm.
And anyone should definitely take the time and try to understand mitochondrial dysfunction and how you can support it.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, that's probably, some would go really heavy on mitochondrial dysfunction and saying that's the root cause of insulin resistance, and that's the root cause of all this different disease is mitochondrial dysfunction. And I think that's a little harder to prove and show right now, but it's definitely something that I think, like the last theory, is just defect of extracellular glucose, and just lack of getting glucose within the cell through blood flow and things like that. It's more of almost like a generic thing. I think targeting insulin resistance from the conversation of lipids and different type of lipids within the muscle is a much more impactful and conversation that we can continue having, because we can easily see, okay, our diet does this, that happens, opposed to the mitochondria is a little more loose, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a chicken or the egg type of thing, because you can say, oh, mitochondria dysfunction is causing this. Well, what if that is also causing mitochondrial dysfunction? So just like with anything in the body, it's never that simple. You can never just hone in on one thing and say, hey, this is the cause. It's almost always multifactorial. You have to go from it from several different angles, and you have to look at the big picture. It's never a bad idea to look small, but you always have to think big when you're dealing with the body.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. But one of those things that you've mentioned was about liver and detoxification. Actually, you just saw a doc on YouTube say how supporting liver and kidney detoxification is just like snake oil, and it didn't like rub me the wrong way, but it does. Those stuff definitely have a bad raps, but it's like there's definitely a lot more literature out there to say how you can support those things. And that is my excellent transition to start talking about insulin resistance in the liver. So anyways, obviously from that transition and my commentary, both Grady and I think you can support liver detoxification.
Yeah.
But anyways, so the most common definition, so now we're just moving cell types and tissue types. And depending on how long, I mean, this podcast, we've been jabbing a while already. I don't think we're going to even get to the diets. I think we'll just probably stop at once we're done with tissues and make this a part two, like a part 1 of 2 type thing. But anyways, because I know you got to get to bed, Grady. I know you love your sleep. Anyways, going on and talking about the liver. So the most common definition of insulin resistance within a hepatocyte or a liver cell is the failure for insulin to suppress hepatic glucose production, or HGP, which in reality is gluconeogenesis. So your liver's ability to create glucose and spit it out to the blood and the rest of the body, because that's what it does during in between meals. That's what it's doing it during when you're fasting at night and sleeping. That's what happens when you don't get any food for several days, and eventually it'll get depleted, but it literally is supposed to give this constant drip of glucose out. And so your liver's ability to respond to insulin to say, hey, stop making it glucose, is what is classically defined as insulin resistant within a hepatocyte. Any thoughts on just that definition there?
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that because of the liver's role in glucose metabolism, but also glucose homeostasis, because that your liver is the buffer. So a bunch of sugar is coming in from your meal. You don't want all that sugar in your bloodstream because that's dangerous. It's going to kill you if all that blood sugar hits it all at once. So your liver is that buffer. And so when that buffer no longer responds as well to the insulin, and therefore it's continuing glucose production and not necessarily inhibiting it after a meal because you don't need all that excess glucose, then it's getting you into not only insulin resistance, but also high blood sugar. And then the high blood sugar is where the damage starts to come in.
Mm-hmm. So imagine this then. So you eat a high glucose meal and you already have insulin resistance. You have high glucose. Your body recognizes through different mechanisms, actually multiple mechanisms, that we should create insulin, right? So we can utilize that glucose. Now, with whole body that insulin resistant, so you are insulin resistant, your muscles are insulin resistant, so you need more insulin to get that glucose in those muscles. But now, not only are you having high glucose and high insulin, but now simultaneously, the glucose isn't going in the muscle, higher insulin levels. That insulin then hits the liver, and the liver doesn't recognize as well that insulin simultaneously. So it doesn't get its signal to stop producing the glucose. Mm-hmm. So now, on top of having high insulin, higher glucose in the blood, you are then continuing to create more glucose and adding that to then this syrupy chemical mixture that is in the blood that continues to raise glucose. And that's part of the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and how that, you could be diagnosed and get in really bad shape as if you were continued down that path. But anyways.
Yeah. And to put it also kind of a big picture too, because we on this podcast, we talk a lot about the glucose response and the glucose homeostasis right after a meal. But at the same time, I have patients where, for example, I had a patient last week where they hadn't eaten since breakfast. This is a type 2 diabetic who hasn't been following instructions, and they ate breakfast, and then I think they had a candy bar like shortly after breakfast, but they hadn't eaten since then. And they saw me at I think it was 6 or 7 at night, and we checked it in the office, and it was 290. And
wow.
So just because he hadn't eaten all day, the blood sugar still hadn't come down yet. And so, looking at this information, it's pretty easy to tell that his liver is still producing sugar. So it's still kicking that out, and it's keeping that blood sugar high, and it's not coming back down. So it's just maintaining that high blood sugar because it's not responding to that insulin.
Wow. I think that puts a really easy picture in everyone's brain. wow, that was a great example. I hope your patient continues to work with you and gets better, because 290 for type 2 is wildly high.
Mm-hmm. Especially
How
after
long
a
is he-
long fast like that.
How long has he been type 2?
He's been
Or
type
she?
2 for a while. And he goes in and out of his diet. So hopefully, I'm hoping he's got a little bit of incentive right now. So I'm hoping that he kind of kicks it into gear, and then I'm gonna try and keep him motivated to keep that in gear, to keep it going, so this can be a long-term change, and so he doesn't go back and yo-yo back again.
Side note, just a tangent, man. If that kind of describes you, or if your blood sugar is out of control like that, and you're type 2, pre-diabetic, type 1, and you're afraid of our current situation this year of COVID-19 and staying healthy and supporting your immune system, that is how you protect yourself. Mm-hmm. Controlling that is number one. If you're not doing that, but doing everything else, that media, like, you are missing a really big part of how to keep you healthy. Mm-hmm. So I just felt like I had to say that, because that, like, your metabolic health is way more linked to your immune system than anyone and everyone else, for the most part. And so, especially as a diabetic. So,
yep.
Anyway.
Yeah. I just want to expand on that a little bit, because, like,
okay.
like you said, if your metabolism or your physiology isn't under control, especially with diabetes, your immune system is significantly impacted. And it doesn't matter if you're wearing a mask, doesn't matter if you're sanitizing everything, you are going to get exposed some way. So if your physiology isn't working for you, then you're setting yourself up for failure potentially. So just because, like I said, just because you're wearing a mask, just because you're sanitizing everything, isn't going to protect you from every scenario. We're being exposed to stuff all the time, and so the best way to prevent those types of infections, or anything serious from happening, is to support your physiology day in, day out, and be consistent with it.
Yeah, I'll definitely say and echo that. Yeah, for sure, the complications and supporting your physiology and supporting anything bad from happening is that. Like, that is. And we really haven't talked about any specifics about anything. We're not even gonna, as time has progressed on this episode, we're not even gonna talk about diet today. We've literally just only talked about muscles. Mm-hmm. and we've talked about blood sugar enough in literally every episode.
Yeah.
But controlling your sugars, controlling your metabolism, controlling your glucose response and homeostasis, moving your body, moving your muscles so that they become more insulin sensitive, being your own athlete. That's protecting yourself. That's longevity. That's what it's all about. And, those are things that anyone and everyone can do. And if you decide to, that power is on you. You have that superpower. You can be empowered in that way. And I just wish everyone, like, if there was one thing I wish could come out of 2020 in terms of health care, is that people, and it is happening to some more people are like, people come to my office, be like, I need to take care of better my health. Like, I have all these risk factors. Like, that's a very small percentage. But if a lot of more people got that in their head, that would be amazing. And moving forward would protect everyone and all of us way more better too. Mm-hmm. But anyways, so this was all just from talking about what what glucose output is during insulin resistance and defining insulin resistance within the liver. So getting it back reeled in. That was a weird stutter. Reeling it back in. So what I wanted to say was that there's a strong connection, essentially everything we've talked about, there's a strong connection between the glucose production of your liver and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And we were talking a little bit about non-alcoholic liver or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease last episode and the adipose tissue threshold theory. We were talking about just how you don't need to be drinking lots of alcohol to make this function of your liver so get all messed up. And it's almost as if, you know, once you start down this path, again, chicken or the egg, but it becomes much harder uphill battle to fight these things. And if you do have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, depending on the severity, it might be pretty hard to reverse. Your liver might get cirrhosis. But if it's just starting to develop, you can still have positive changes on your glucose production from your liver and try to help those fats that are sticking on the liver. And I think, again, when we start talking about these things, it's easy. I don't think you and I have bashed fat by any means, but it's easy to say all these things and walk away with a message of, oh, yeah, fat is bad. And I don't think either you or I think that's the case, but there's a very strong connection between non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and insulin resistance, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, even if it is in some of the later stages, your liver is one of the organs that is one of the most resistant or resilient organs in the body. And so by making changes, you know, getting your life back on track, making those healthy choices, you're going to be improving the function of that organ from whatever is left over. So if you have, you know, 20% left, you might as well improve the function of that 20% and have a higher quality of life because of it. There's never, at least in my book, there's never a lost cause, and you can always improve the function that you do have. Matter does have limitations. Sometimes we can only do so much, but at the same time, use and utilize to your max capacity what you do have left.
Right. And taking it in a non-diabetic physiology thought. I love this word. I don't know why. And normal glycemic people. I just think it's a funny way to describe non-diabetics.
Yeah.
And normal glycemic people, if this wasn't clear before, so insulin on the liver is supposed to shut down gluconeogenesis. It's supposed to shut down that glucose production. And when, just like how in muscle, if there is higher lipids within the hepatocyte and higher lipids on top of the liver, it makes it, the liver actually then transports more triglycerides. It ends up transporting more lipid molecules, LDLs, ends up transporting more cholesterol. There's more lipogenesis or creation of fats normally when insulin acts on the liver and that's in that environment. However, in the liver or hepatocyte that's more insulin resistant, you're still going to produce those things just like in a normal function of insulin on a liver, but now the glucose production isn't being shut down. Mm-hmm. And then continuing to elevate both more lipids and more glucose. And it then continues to add, it's almost like there are a million different ways for the body to increase the glucose and to make it harder to use the glucose and make it harder to use the insulin to get the glucose in the cell. They all amplify one another, mm-hmm. right? But essentially, if your liver is insulin resistant, you're going to continue to produce lipids, continue to make it a different type of environment for your whole body while producing glucose. And that in itself, I think is important just to recognize as you start to read through this literature. Again, I don't think fats are bad, but understanding how and why those lipids might be used and why your body's producing them, and not saying, all right, let's just minimize everything. Let's all just take statins. Let's all do all these other things. Figuring out why there's insulin resistance in the first place, figuring out how you can get rid of it, figuring out how you can use your diet, which we're going to talk about eventually, or continue to talk about. We've been talking about like for 20 something episodes now, mm-hmm. But we will continue to discuss how you can use diet and all those other things to reduce those states. But I think talking about the physiology of it, it should be step one at some level, just hearing it one time and moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think understanding the process helps make the decision to make a change a little bit easier, because now you understand what's going on and how what you're going to be implementing is actually going to be helping you. I think understanding really provides not necessarily motivation, but a little bit more clarity. And therefore, with clarity, you have more confidence in what you're going to be doing is actually going to make a change for yourself.
Right. Yeah. When you have that clarity, when you're invested, just when you're invested in it, it's easier to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I've never, what did somebody offer me recently that I was like, why would I ever just have that by itself? I think it was like a zebra cake or something. But I was like, no, like, not because I judge you or I think it's like, I just understand enough to be like, nah, I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my cells don't need that. Anyways, but yet my cells need margaritas, like I talked about earlier.
Oh, God.
Anyways, so one of the last things these authors then talked about in this review is adipose tissue. And they didn't say a whole heck of a lot in their summarization of the literature that I looked at. The biggest takeaway I got from this was that your white adipose tissue, because you have white and brown. Most of your adipose, your fat, is white and is less metabolically active than your brown. And depending on how obese you are, will change on how much percent of mass is white adipose tissue. So that then changes things. But white adipose tissue doesn't use a whole lot of glucose intake. It only takes about 3% of glucose clearing, or rather of the available glucose that from a meal, it only takes about 3%, because then it would take it from other forms, most likely from the forms of fat, And so besides that, and saying brown adipose is more metabolically active, I think the biggest thing I took away from their summarization, which I think is a fact that needs to be talked about more, is that your adipose and your fat cells are actually not just connective tissue, but are as an immune cell, as well as it's immune cell, and it's part of your metabolism, and it's just way more than just stuffing for your body to keep warm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
it's a traditionally it's thought of as just a storage unit, but like I said, it's part of your immune system because it produces a lot of cytokines, so that can create a lot of inflammation in and of itself. So increased adipose tissue or increased fat is going to increase the amount of inflammation that's flying around the body. But then also it's a hormone factory. It's going to affect your hormones. And when you have insulin resistance on top of a lot of fat cells, you're going to have a lot of aromatase activity. And aromatase is an enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen for males. And in females, you have a different enzyme. I'm blanking on the enzyme right now, but in fat cells, that will convert estrogen into testosterone. So essentially, you're turning males into females and females into males when you're adding a lot of adipose tissue and insulin resistance in combination, which if you have a lot of adipose tissue, there's a high likelihood that there's insulin resistance going on. So it can affect your hormones too. So if you have a lot of hormonal issues, this is something you need to really look at and pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. So I think from here that, maybe that's all we will say for this episode, and we'll talk more about what these authors say about different types of diets after that, and give our 2 cents about those. That definitely was way more of a fluid conversation, but I thought I always love reading and rereading Physiology. Because the more you think about this, more you hear about this from different perspectives, the more you can summate your own thoughts, the more you can summate what's actually happening, the more you can interpret it from different providers, from different specialists, and try to understand how to use it for your life. Walking away, I thought, when it comes to insulin resistance in muscles, for example, I think it's almost kind of hard to just say these are the main insulin resistant models. But, you know, rereading it this way from these authors was maybe a little easier. Like, oh, okay, like it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, it's these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important in that way. So, but you know, next time we'll talk about different diets. We'll talk about like how different fats affect things. You know, why omega-3s are important. You know, there's lots of discussion to be had, both that these authors have and that you and I will continue to have, based off what they say and what other authors say as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, that being said, we already have done burst our beta cells. So let's be a little positive. So, Grady, did you feel free from diabetes, or what was like a diabetic win for you recently?
Let's see. Sometimes it's always harder to recognize, at least for me, recognize the positive things.
That's why we're taking a moment to be present for you to think about it.
I don't know. I feel like in a general sense, now that I've started that new program that I talked about, it has kept me more accountable because it has like specific days that says, all right, you're doing this on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And while I don't necessarily follow like the days, because sometimes I go more days than what the program says, it keeps me more consistent, because before I was being a lot more inconsistent. I wasn't, going every day, or at least going at a consistent rate, whether that was, once every other day or every day, or, whatever it wasn't consistent. And so the results that I was getting weren't very good. My blood sugar metabolism wasn't as good as I know it can be. And so now that I've started that, it's definitely helped my glucose metabolism, my blood sugar stability, and I'm also, seeing more results visual wise, so that's always nice.
Hey.
Yeah. So
go on.
So
I was gonna say getting rid of that quarantine gut.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, it's definitely nice being back in the gym. I'm just not one of those people that can do body weight workouts and feel satisfied from it. I need to lift heavy things and throw weight around. So I'm happy to be back, and I'm glad I decided to start one of my old programs, because it's been helping out in a lot of different ways. What about you?
Well, I'm glad that you're feeling that's impacting you in a good way. I saw my endocrinologist today. It's been a while since I've seen him, probably 6 months, mostly because of COVID, but also insurance changes and things like that. But with everything going on, I was worried about seeing my A1C. I haven't got blood labs on myself in a while, and especially having dental. I think, when I had those dental surgeries, I think I might have talked about it on the podcast, but I think I did, because I talked about burst my beta cells and how it totally messed me up.
Yep.
And so I guess a couple of things that have been diabetic wins. One, this is the second time I've seen this endocrinologist, and I freaking love him. Like, finding an endocrinologist you can get along with is really important, and somebody who is invested into understanding my diabetes and caring as much as I am, and as many as you are, or as much as you are, Grady, or many of our listeners. Getting one that respects my decisions, my thought process, my choices, as well as then just respects me as a colleague, whether they think I'm a colleague or not. Having all of that is great. And so seeing him was just good, but getting my A1C was 6.4, which I was really happy with. I would have taken a much higher number because of all the anesthesia that was put under with my teeth, with the steroids I had to go under, because that all messed me up for so long, because those steroids and cortisol raise your blood sugar, and apparently anesthesia just screws with your autonomic nervous system so much that it just whacks you over the head, and stress and plenty of other things, I totally thought it was going to be way higher than it was. So I was definitely happy with that. So that was definitely a win. And then just a general win, I would say, relating to my diabetes, is just starting to work out again more too. I've been running pretty consistently throughout all of this, but getting back to the gym feels nice. I just joined a new workout regimen myself. and it does a lot more Olympic type lifting and things like that. And I've never done Olympic lifting, and oh my goodness, moving weight around and doing those complex movements is so much fun. But definitely going into it, I had to humble myself and say, can't use a lot of weight as I figure this out, because man, it takes, the thing that about Olympic lifting that is really cool is that it's an art. There was both this,
definitely.
there's a masculine and femininity. There's a acceleration, deceleration, a yin and yang to all of this, and within the same movement. It's like how just trying to get my brain to move that way, because for me, lifting weights and deadlifting has always just been like, let's fucking go, and so just this pure like one side of things, and it's a little bit of both. There's a lot more finesse, there's so much other of this stuff, so it's been really fun to do new things, get my blood sugars in control while doing them, and then see the benefits throughout the day. And so just a win, I guess, for my overall health is doing something different.
Yeah,
I would give myself. So
yeah, it's always exciting to change up the type of exercise, do something new, something new and challenging, and learning a new skill, because those movements are very skillful and very complex, like you said. So you're challenging your brain at the same time.
Oh yeah.
So that's always good.
Oh yeah. It was also funny too, because before I even started chiropractic school, I think it was like somewhere in college, I stopped shrugging. And I stopped doing shrugs, because whenever I shrugged, it created this cervical rotation. I couldn't not just turn my head when I did a shrug, and I was like, well, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
And so I stopped doing shrugs years and years ago. But shrugging is a really important skill for my brain to do with all these lifts too. And so I can shrug fine and not my neck be all jacked up. But anyways, yeah, it's learning a skill. That's something that I hope a lot of people just continue to do. Last tangent. I had a patient, 90 years old, and like, sure, his physical health wasn't the best, but this guy was 90 years old, and I've seen people in their 30s to 60s have worse spines than he did.
Yeah.
And I got so excited that he was stretched every day. He moved so much, and he continued to use his brain. That's by far why he's thriving at the age he is. He continued to, make things and then edit things, and trying to be as generic as possible. And he just continued to use his brain and skills throughout life, and he took care of his body. It was just so dang exciting to see somebody thriving in that way, especially more so than maybe of their peers. But anyways, wins for the day. Get excited when old people do well. and move the dang body. Next episode, we'll talk more about specific diets and how fats can be in those, take a part and either negatively or positively impact things, and what to be considered, especially when reading literature. As well as in future episodes, we have a couple of guests lined up, so we're excited for that too. And actually, I'm really excited. And yeah, just stay tuned for those types of things. And appreciate, as always, everyone listening, giving us private messages and just interacting with us in the ways that they have. And it's just an honor just to be able to talk to some people this way.
Yeah, definitely. We really appreciate it, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Peace.